Do Radeon cards age better than Nvidia? AMD's graphics cards have long been perceived to age better than their competition, thanks to performance improvements brought by driver updates. Fans have even coined the term fine wine to describe the phenomenon. This video puts the fine wine theory to the test by examining precisely how much ground AMD cards have gained over their contemporary competition from Geforce. We shall use data from Tech PowerUp, as this is the only site we know that summarizes all their games results into one chart that shows how graphics cards stack up against each other in each resolution. Furthermore, they use the latest drivers at the time of the review and do not recycle performance results. We'll compare how relative performance changed over the years with 6 generations: the 680 and 7970s, the 780s and 290s, Maxwell and Fury, Polaris, Pascal and Vega. If you find this subject interesting, please share this video to spread the word. Also, please hit the like, subscribe and bell buttons as there's more content like this on the way. To start, let's rewind the clock to early 2012 and analyze the first generation that exhibited this remarkable endurance, the Radeon 7900 series. The 7970 was the first 28nm GPU on the market, though it soon had to contend with competition from Nvidia's GTX 680. The 680 was 7.52% ahead of the 7970 at 1080p performance and 4.17% ahead at 1600p performance when it launched in March of 2012. Not to be outdone, AMD reclaimed the performance throne with the 7970 GHz edition, which outstripped the 680 by 2% at 1080p and 8.7% at 1600p at the time of its launch in June 2012. Fast forward 1 year to May 2013, and the 7970 GHz edition's lead had shrunk to 3.8% in 1600p performance, while the 680's lead over the regular 7970 rose to 5.3%. In its first year, the 680 had gained 1.13% on the 7970 and 4.9% on the 7970 GHz edition at 1600p performance. Moving down to 1080p, the 680 reached parity with the 7970 GHz edition, and its lead over the regular 7970 rose to 9.2%. In its first year, the 680 had gained 1.68% on the 7970 and 2% on the GHz edition in 1080p performance. Jumped 6 months ahead to November 2013, the 680 had overtaken the 7970 GHz edition and was now 1.39% faster at 1080p performance, while its lead over the regular 7970 rose to 10.6%. Moving up to 1600p though, the 7970 GHz edition was still 4.47% ahead of the 680, while the 680's lead over the regular 7970 had shrunk to 4.69%. In 6 months, the 7970 had gained 0.61% on the 680 in 1600p performance, while the GHz edition had gained 0.67% on the 680 at the same resolution. This was a time that these two generations were replaced by their successors, Geforce 780 series and the AMD 290 cards. But we'll come back to that later, as we must resume following the 680 and 7970's journey. Fast forward 10 months to September 2014. 2.5 years since the 680's launch. It had lost its lead over the 7970 GHz edition at 1080p performance, though it was still a comfortable 10.34% faster than the regular 7970. Jumping up to 1600p, the 7970 GHz edition's lead rose slightly to 4.76%, while the 680's lead over the regular 7970 had shrunk further to 3.28%. In 10 months, the 7970 had gained 1.41% on the 680 in 1600p performance, while the GHz edition's relative advance of 0.29% is negligible in comparison. Sadly, Tech PowerUp stopped benchmarking the 680 and the 7970s midway into 2015, publishing their last benchmark of these cards in April 2015, 3 years since the 7970 and the 680 launched. At 1080p, even the regular 7970 had surpassed the 680, beating it by 3%. To put this in context, the 7970 performed 93% as fast as the 680 when the 680 launched 3 years prior. In a span of 3 years, the 7970 gained 10% on the 680, which was enough to completely turn the tables at 1080p performance. Meanwhile, the 7970 GHz edition was 13% faster than the 680 at 1080p, a dramatic improvement from the 2% lead it launched with 3 years earlier. To summarize 1080p performance, the 7970 GHz edition gained an incredible 11% on the 680 in just 3 years. Moving up to 1440p, the 7970 was an impressive 7.92% faster than the 680, while the GHz edition was a massive 17.82% ahead of the 680. Tech PowerUp had originally benchmarked these cards at 1600p, but later substituted that test for 1440p. So we shall treat it as a continuation of the same test and compare the relative performance changes. The 7970 was 96% as fast as the 680 when the 680 launched in March 2012. The 7970 gained a remarkable 12% on the 680 in just 3 years. When the 7970 GHz edition launched in 2012, it was 8.7% faster than the 680. In 2015, the GHz edition was 17.82% ahead of the 680, meaning it had gained 9.12% on the 680 in just 3 years. Let's move on to their successors, AMD's 290 series and Nvidia's 780 Ti. When they launched in November 2013, the 780 Ti was 8.69% faster than the 290X set at Uber mode, while the 290 measured a mere 1.01% higher than the 780 at 1080p performance. Jumping up to 1600p though, the 780 Ti's lead over the 290X shrank to 7.52%, while the 290's lead over the 780 rose to 4.167%. Let's move on to Tech PowerUp's December 2014 benchmark, published more than a year since the 290's and the 780 Ti's launch. At 1440p, the 780 Ti's lead over the 290X had shrunk to 1.92%, whilst the 290's lead over the 780 had risen to 10.34%. In their first year, the 290X had gained 5.6% on the 780 Ti, while the 290 had gained 6.173% on the 780. Dropping down to 1080p though, the 780 Ti was still ahead of the 290X by 6.12%, though this still means the 290X shrunk the gap by 2.57% in its first year. The 290 was 5.75% faster than the 780, a gain of 4.74% in its first year. Skip ahead 12 months to November 2015, 2 years since the 780 Ti launched. The 290X had now surpassed the 780 Ti in 1080p as well, performing 1.58% faster than the 780 Ti. At 1080p, the 290X had gained a remarkable 7.35% over the 780 Ti in its second year, and an incredible 9.59% since its launch 2 years earlier. Meanwhile, the 290 was 11.32% faster than the 780 at 1080p, a gain of 5.57% in its second year, and an incredible 10.31% since it launched 2 years earlier. Moving up to 1440p though, the 290X was 3.39% faster than the 780 Ti. The 290X had gained 5.28% on the 780 Ti in its second year, and over 10.39% since it launched 2 years prior. Meanwhile, the 290 was 18.75% faster than the 780, a gain of over 8.41% in its second year. Counting from its launch in November 2013, the 290 had gained 14.58% on the 780 in just 2 years. Fast forward another 8 months to July 2016, Tech PowerUp's last benchmark of the 290s and 780s. The 290X had lost its lead in 1080p, while the 290's lead rose to 16.2%. At 1080p, the 290 had gained nearly 5% in just 8 months, and over 15% since its first launched over 2.5 years earlier. Moving up to 1440p, the 290X was now 6.59% faster than the 780 Ti, a gain of 3.2% in just 8 months, and a relative improvement of 13.59% since it launched 2 years and 8 months earlier. Meanwhile, the 290 was an incredible 23.28% faster than the 780, a gain of 4.53% in just 8 months, and a staggering gain of 19.11% since it launched in November 2013. Let's move on to the next generation, Nvidia's 980 Ti and AMD's Fury X, both of which launched in June 2015. At this time, the 980 Ti was 14% faster than the Fury X at 1080p performance. At 1440p, AMD's Fury X was 9% behind Nvidia's 980 Ti. 1 year later, the 980 Ti's lead shrunk to 3.8% for 1440p performance, and its 1080p lead had shrunk to 10.83%. Looking at 1440p, the Fury X had gained 5.2% on the 980 Ti in its first year and closed the gap by 3.17% in 1080p performance. 2 years later, the Fury X was 4% faster than the 980 Ti at 1440p performance, while the 980 Ti's lead at 1080p had shrunk to 2.53%. In its second year, the Fury X had gained almost 8% over the 980 Ti at 1440p, and in 1080p performance it had reduced 980 Ti's lead by a remarkable 8.3%. 3 years later, the Fury X was 1.73% faster than the 980 Ti at 1440p performance, while the 980 Ti was 2.72% faster at 1080p performance. The Fury X's third year saw it lose 2.27% of its lead in 1440p performance, and an additional but negligible 0.2% in 1080p. It seems the Fury X ran out of fine wine in 2018. Nevertheless, since its launch 3 years ago, the Fury X has gained 10.7% over the 980 Ti in 1440p performance and closed the gap by 11.28% at 1080p. Let's move on to the next generations, Polaris and Pascal. When the 1060 launched on July 19, 2016, the RX 480 performed 90% as fast as the 1060 at 1080p and 91% as fast as a GTX 1060 at 1440p. 1 year after they launched, the 480 now performed 98.39% as fast as the 1060 at 1440p, an improvement of 7.39% in its first year. The 480 showed the exact same improvement at 1080p, where it now performed 97% as fast as the 1060, up from 90% when it launched a year ago. 2 years after launch, the 480 now performs 94.79% as fast as the 1060 at 1440p, meaning the 480 has lost 3.6% to the 1060 in 2018. Dropping down to 1080p performance, the 480 now performs 94.84% as fast as the 1060, a loss of 2.16% in its second year. Since its launch 2 years ago, the 480 has gained 4.84% in 1080p performance and 3.79% at 1440p. Nevertheless, the 480 has not yet overtaken the 1060 as of this video. Let's move on to our final generation, AMD's Vega. At launch, the 1080 was 4% ahead of RX Vega 64 at 1080p performance and just 1% ahead at 1440p performance. 1 year later, the 1080 is 4.8% faster than Vega 64 at 1080p performance and 1.96% faster at 1440p performance. It's safe to say Vega 64 has not received its fine wine supplement yet. That wraps up our analysis of AMD's fine wine. We will let you draw your own conclusions from the numbers we crunched. If you like this video, please share it. Our next hardware analysis will compare which is faster, 50% more cores or 50% more threads. Please like, subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified as soon as it's out. Do you play Rainbow Six Siege or Dota 2? Check out the other channel for analytical guides for both games. Link is in the description and on the screen. Whilst you're here, feel free to watch the history of Denuvo, our analysis of the impact Denuvo has on loading times, and our analysis of how fast processors would be if every Intel architecture was as revolutionary as Sandy Bridge.